Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 102. Have you ever witnessed a time capsule being buried? It's like a message being launched into the future. The artifacts of your time being carefully preserved for a future generation to marvel at and enjoy. Or perhaps you've been present when a time capsule is dug up. That's even more exciting. What message has the past left behind for the present generation? Will it be something fascinating and intriguing, or will it be something mundane and disappointing? Perhaps the biggest time capsule in all of history was buried in the autumn of AD 79. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Today, we begin by looking at historical facts, the banana peels upon which historians build their accounts of history. Now perhaps you're thinking that this is a needlessly negative point of view. After all, a fact's a fact, isn't it? If only the world were that simple. Establishing the facts of history can be surprisingly difficult. In many ways, it's like taking witness statements at a crime scene. Everyone saw the same crime, but every account is just a bit different. And that's because every witness is a human being. Humans see things through the filter of their senses, assumptions, biases, and prejudices. Historical witnesses are no different. Recorded histories are shaped by the limitations, biases, and prejudices of their authors. Every culture, ancient or modern, tends to write its history the way it wants to be remembered. We also need to remember that the farther back you go in time, the harder it is to establish the facts. As a former professor once remarked, historians of World War II have a much easier time than historians of the Roman Empire. And this leads us to a key principle that we must never forget. The facts of ancient history are usually much sparser than those of comparatively recent history. This means that our factual confidence decreases the deeper we go back into time. So historians are up against many of the same problems that crime scene investigators face. There's one big difference, however. In most cases, historians don't get to talk to the actual witnesses because they're long dead. Instead, historians interact with those witnesses through indirect means. Let's look at a few examples of the means available to us from the ancient world. Documents are one of our primary sources for ancient facts. These may be recorded on clay tablets, parchments, or papyrus. They can be as mundane as an accounting ledger, or as detailed as the chronicles of an empire. Perhaps you remember the insomniac king of Esther chapter 6 who tried to get to sleep with the help of a history book. Some things don't change much. Among the many documents available to us from the ancient world are books written by historians. I'm sure you're familiar with some of their names even if you haven't read their books. Herodotus, Berosus, Josephus, Tacitus, and many others. One thing you should always remember about ancient historians, however, is that they weren't playing by the rules that historians follow today. History wasn't an academic discipline, so you couldn't go to school to become a historian. Writers didn't feel obligated to check their sources for credibility. Plagiarism was common. Currying favor with powerful patrons by tweaking history was expected, and formal peer review was non-existent. But the works of ancient historians are still extremely useful. Even though the glass is tinted, their accounts are still windows into the past. Even more significantly, their histories often quote passages from older documents that no longer exist. Many of our facts come to us at second or even third hand through the historians of the past. And every once in a while, historians and lovers of ancient documents strike pay dirt. One such case was a giant time capsule buried by a volcano in AD 79. I'm sure you've heard of it, the Roman town of Herculaneum. Buried under tens of meters of volcanic ash, Herculaneum remained undiscovered and intact until the early 18th century. When excavations began, historians were amazed at how well the city was preserved as well as what it contained. Among the many significant artifacts discovered, however, none was quite so exciting as a luxury home, now known as the Villa of the Papyrii. And the reason for this excitement? Inside that home was a complete library containing over 1,800 papyrus scrolls. No other ancient world library of this size has ever been discovered. Unfortunately, excitement was tempered by an unpleasant reality. The tightly rolled papyrus scrolls had been carbonized by the heat of the volcanic matter that had buried the town. Unrolling them so they could be read looked to be almost impossible. Beginning in the 1750s, various experts tinkered with unrolling techniques. Some were successful, while others reduced priceless scrolls to little more than fragments. Today, many of the unrolled scrolls have been successfully digitized using sophisticated imaging techniques and are available to scholars for study. Many remain unopened due to extreme fragility. Scientists are now focusing on non-destructive techniques using various X-ray scanning methods and exotic software to try to virtually unroll the scroll. Success has been limited, but the work goes on. Besides complete documents, we also obtain historical facts from shorter texts, such as inscriptions on monuments and buildings. These give us names, brief histories, and insights into the purpose of the structure. Some inscriptions even reveal personalities. Consider this translated excerpt from an inscription on the Ishtar Gate of the city of Babylon. I pulled down these gates and laid their foundations at the water table with asphalt and bricks, and had them made of bricks with blue stone on which wonderful bulls and dragons were depicted. I covered their roofs by laying majestic cedars lengthwise over them. I fixed doors of cedar wood adorned with bronze at all the gate openings. I placed wild bulls and ferocious dragons in the gateways, and thus adorn them with luxurious splendor so that mankind might gaze on them in wonder. Anyone who has read the book of Daniel will be unsurprised to learn that this inscription was written by Nebuchadnezzar II, the larger-than-life king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Less formal textual fragments also illuminate history. You may be surprised to learn that the workers who built the Great Pyramid at Giza left graffiti behind that shed some light on that mammoth building project. Once, when I was visiting a museum, I noticed doodles around the margins of a medieval manuscript. That familiar response to boredom taught me one thing about history: people don't change much. Not all historical facts come from textual records. Objects tell us a lot about history, too. In the case of non-literate cultures, objects may be all that we have. Typical examples include tools, household utensils, jewelry, coins, weapons, and clothing. Historians often gain access to these objects through the work of archaeologists. Besides the small things, archaeologists sometimes uncover whole towns and cities, like Herculaneum and its sister city of Pompeii. Tombs and palaces can be rich finds as well. But we must never forget that archaeology, like all other forms of historical study, involves a lot of interpretation and opinion. Archaeologists are influenced by their education and the dominant theories of their time. As history itself shows, archaeological conclusions change as new evidence emerges and old theories pass off the scene. So much for the ancient world. What about more recent history? As you can guess, historians who study more recent times use many of the same sources for their facts. But they have the happy advantage of greater choice than their colleagues who focus on the more distant periods. As we get closer and closer to our own time, new sources of facts emerge. Historians of the 19th century have photographs from that time period. Those who study the 20th century have movies, sound recordings, and digital sources of information. Our almost obsessively documented 21st century will undoubtedly be a treasure trove to historians of the future. More importantly, historians of recent times have the advantage of a formal academic discipline with principles, guidelines, rules, and peer review. While far from perfect, modern history has many advantages compared to its predecessors. And this brings us to a related subject, one that's crucial for us to keep in mind as we study history. How do we evaluate and judge our facts? Needless to say, that's a challenging question and one that can't be answered in just a few minutes. Student historians spend years learning the guidelines of historical research and judgment. So let's confine ourselves to a few basic principles to assist us as we sort through historical facts. First, we should remember that historical facts are often tentative rather than certain. As we go back into history, facts get thinner on the ground and harder to evaluate. Good historians are always ready to revise their ideas based on better information. Second, be aware that historians don't always check every fact. Many just repeat what they've read from other historians' works. This practice is true for historians of all periods, including modern ones. In many cases, they're on safe ground doing this, but this practice can lead to an idea being mindlessly believed and repeated. Wise historians periodically reassess their information and take advantage of new discoveries to correct commonly held false assumptions. Third, bear in mind that historical dates are not always certain. Again, the farther back we go in time, the less certain we are about dates. While it would have been nice if historical figures had carefully dated everything they did, few were that obliging. As a general rule, dates from the last few centuries are much more certain and reliable than those from earlier periods. Fourth, we should always take the works of pre-modern historians with a few grains of salt, and maybe some pepper too. Until history became a formal academic discipline with peer review, there were few checks and balances acting on historians. Overt personal bias and prejudice was acceptable. Documenting one's sources wasn't considered essential. Legends, oral tradition, and just plain guessing were used to fill in gaps. Adjusting history to support a good cause or encourage greater virtue was perfectly acceptable. While we frequently lament the so-called revisionist history of our own time, revisionism has always been a common practice. After all, human beings haven't changed much. They're still subject to their own weaknesses, agendas, blindnesses, and misplaced ideologies. Few value truth as much as their own welfare and advantage. And on that cynical but realistic note, we close for today. Next time, we examine something as important as the facts of history: time. Time is, after all, the organizer of history. Humans are intrinsically time-oriented. Our lives move along a line that stretches from the past and extends into the future. Unlike God, who exists outside of time, we always see events in relation to the past, present, or future. For the historian, establishing the time relationship between facts is key to making sense of them. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.